What happens when Charleston's most eligible heiress falls for the one man she can never have? In 1827, Catherine Middleton shocked high society by carrying the child of Marcus, her family's most trusted house slave. Their forbidden love ignited the biggest scandal in South Carolina history, destroying a plantation dynasty that had ruled Charleston for generations. This is the story of a woman who chose love over legacy and paid the ultimate price. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button for more untold stories. Catherine Middleton stood at her bedroom window watching the flames consume everything she had ever known. The Middleton mansion, pride of Charleston's elite for 3 generations, crackled and roared as orange tongues licked at imported silk curtains and mahogany furniture shipped from England. But Catherine wasn't thinking about the house. She was thinking about Marcus and the choice that had led them both to this moment of destruction. 6 months earlier, Catherine had been Charleston's golden daughter. At 22, she possessed everything Southern society valued in a woman: porcelain skin untouched by labor, golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, and a dowry that made grown men stammer. The Middleton plantation stretched across 8,000 acres of prime South Carolina rice fields, worked by 400 enslaved souls. Catherine's father, William Middleton, controlled more wealth than some European nobles, and every prominent family from Savannah to Richmond sought her hand for their sons. But Catherine had always been different. While other plantation daughters learned embroidery and piano, she had wandered the rice fields asking questions that made overseers uncomfortable. Why did the workers sing while they labored? What did their songs mean? How did they know which plants would heal and which would harm? Her curiosity had worried her mother, Elizabeth, who spent countless hours trying to redirect Catherine's attention towards suitable pursuits. A lady's mind should concern itself with beauty and grace, Elizabeth would say, not with the workings of the fields. The difference became dangerous when Catherine turned 18 and Marcus arrived at Middleton Plantation. He had been purchased from a failing estate in Virginia, recommended as an exceptional house servant with unusual education. His previous owner, an eccentric scholar, had taught Marcus to read and write, skills that made him invaluable for managing household accounts and correspondence. Marcus stood 6 feet tall with intelligent dark eyes and hands that moved with precision, whether he was serving tea or calculating figures. Most dangerously of all, he possessed a quiet dignity that seemed unbroken despite his circumstances. Catherine first noticed Marcus during her father's weekly business meetings. While other house slaves kept their eyes down and moved silently, Marcus would catch her glance and hold it for just a moment too long. There was something in those brief exchanges that made Catherine's heart race in ways that her mother's lectures about appropriate courtship had never prepared her for. Marcus seemed to see her not as Charleston's prize heiress, but as Catherine, a young woman with thoughts and dreams beyond what society expected. The first real conversation happened by accident. Catherine had been reading in the library when a summer storm struck suddenly, trapping her alone with Marcus, who was organizing her father's papers. Instead of maintaining proper silence, Catherine found herself asking about the book Marcus had been discreetly reading, a volume of poetry by Phyllis Wheatley. "You know her work?" Catherine asked, amazed to discover Marcus not only could read, but chose to read poetry. "She writes about freedom," Marcus replied carefully, "in ways that make freedom feel possible." Something in his voice made Catherine realize that this conversation was the most honest exchange she had ever had with another person. Their friendship developed slowly, hidden in stolen moments and carefully casual encounters. Catherine would find excuses to visit the library when Marcus was working there. She began asking him about the books he read, the thoughts he had about the world beyond Middleton Plantation. Marcus, despite the enormous risk, began sharing his perspectives about literature, philosophy, even politics. Catherine discovered that Marcus possessed an intelligence that had been carefully concealed, and a worldview that challenged everything she had been taught about the natural order of society. The intellectual connection grew into something deeper over the spring of 1827. Catherine found herself counting the hours until she might encounter Marcus in the hall or the library. She began leaving books for him to find, volumes of poetry and philosophy that expressed feelings she couldn't speak aloud. Marcus responded with careful notes hidden in the margins, thoughts and questions that revealed a mind as curious and searching as her own. They developed a coded language of glances and gestures that allowed them to communicate even in the presence of others. Everything changed on a May evening when Catherine encountered Marcus in the garden after dark. She had been unable to sleep, troubled by her father's announcement that he was arranging her engagement to Robert Ashford, heir to a neighboring plantation. Catherine had wandered outside seeking solitude, only to find Marcus sitting beneath the magnolia tree, reading by moonlight. "I can't marry him," Catherine whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I know," Marcus replied, and in those two words Catherine heard understanding that no one else had ever offered her. That night they talked until dawn about dreams and fears, about the prison that wealth had created for Catherine, and the brutality that slavery had created for Marcus. They discovered that despite the vast differences in their circumstances, they shared the same sense of being trapped by a world they had never chosen. Catherine learned that Marcus dreamed of freedom not just for himself, but for a life where people could choose their own paths. Marcus discovered that Catherine's privilege felt like a cage, golden but confining, where every choice was made for her by others. The conversation ended with a kiss that changed everything. It was gentle, desperate, and completely impossible. In that moment, Catherine realized she was in love with a man she could never publicly acknowledge, and Marcus understood that his feelings for Catherine could cost him his life. They pulled apart knowing that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and that the consequences would eventually destroy them both. The summer of 1827 became a season of secret meetings and growing desperation. Catherine and Marcus found ways to be alone together, stolen hours in the early morning or late evening when the household was asleep. They met in the old rice barn, in the library after midnight, in the garden before dawn. Each encounter deepened their connection and increased the danger they faced. Catherine began declining social invitations, claiming illness to avoid the young men her father brought to court her. Her behavior worried her parents, but they attributed it to nerves about her upcoming engagement. The relationship remained secret until August, when Catherine made a discovery that would change everything. She was late, then sick, then certain. She was carrying Marcus's child. The realization hit her like a physical blow, not because she regretted their love, but because she understood that this pregnancy would destroy everyone she cared about. There would be no hiding this, no explaining it away, no pretending it had never happened. Charleston society would demand blood, and her father would have no choice but to provide it. Catherine spent 3 days in agony before telling Marcus. When she finally found the courage to speak, Marcus's reaction surprised her. Instead of panic or regret, she saw determination in his eyes. "We have to run," he said simply. "Tonight." Marcus had been preparing for this possibility, saving money, studying maps, making contact with people who could help them reach the north. He had hoped they would never need these preparations, but he had known that their love could only end in escape or tragedy. But Catherine couldn't leave. Not yet, not without trying to find another way. "Give me 2 weeks," she begged. "Let me try to talk to my father to make him understand." Marcus knew it was hopeless, but he also knew that Catherine needed to try. They agreed to wait, to hope for a miracle that they both knew would never come. Catherine spent those 2 weeks trying to imagine how to tell her father that she loved a slave, that she was carrying his child, that she wanted to throw away everything the Middleton family had built for 3 generations. The conversation never happened because the secret was discovered first. Sarah, Catherine's personal maid, noticed the signs and told Elizabeth, who confronted Catherine with a fury that shook the mansion's walls. "How could you do this to us?" Elizabeth screamed. "How could you destroy everything we are?" Catherine tried to explain about love, about choosing her own life, about Marcus's intelligence and kindness. But Elizabeth heard only betrayal and madness. "That animal has bewitched you," she sobbed. "We'll find a way to fix this, but first we have to make sure no one else ever knows." William Middleton's reaction was worse than anger. It was cold, calculating rage that promised swift and terrible consequences. "Where is he?" was all he said when Elizabeth told him. Catherine realized that her father intended to kill Marcus immediately, publicly, as an example to other slaves who might dare to forget their place. She had minutes to warn him, minutes to save his life, minutes to choose between her family and the man she loved. Catherine ran through the house like a woman possessed, searching for Marcus before her father's overseers could find him. She discovered him in the stables, already preparing to saddle a horse. He had heard Elizabeth's screams and understood what they meant. "Go," Catherine whispered urgently. "Ride north and don't stop." But Marcus hesitated, unwilling to leave Catherine to face the consequences alone. "Our child," he said, touching her hand. "I'll find you both, I promise." That promise became impossible to keep because Catherine's screams began before Marcus reached the plantation's borders. Her father's men had surrounded the stables and dragged Marcus from his horse with chains and ropes. They beat him unconscious and carried him to the center of the plantation, where William Middleton waited with a noose. "Let this be a lesson," he announced to the assembled slaves, "about what happens when you forget your place." But the execution never happened because Catherine appeared, still in her nightgown, carrying a loaded pistol. "Stop," she commanded, pointing the weapon at her father's chest. "Let him go." The plantation fell silent except for Marcus's labored breathing and Catherine's determined voice. "I love him, and he loves me, and I won't let you murder him for that." William Middleton stared at his daughter, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. She was no longer his obedient child. She was a woman who had chosen her path and would defend it with her life. The standoff lasted until Catherine made her final offer. "Let him go, and I'll leave Charleston forever. You'll never see me again, never have to explain my choices to society. But if you kill him, I'll tell everyone in Charleston exactly what happened here tonight." It wasn't much of a bargain, but it was the only leverage Catherine possessed. Her father understood that a scandal could be managed more easily than a murder witnessed by 400 slaves. Marcus was released but banished from South Carolina with the promise that he would be hunted down and killed if he ever returned. Catherine was confined to her room while her parents decided what to do with a daughter who had chosen love over loyalty. The answer came within days. Catherine would be sent to a distant relative in Philadelphia, where her pregnancy could be hidden and the child quietly disposed of. The Middleton family would announce that Catherine had died of fever, a tragedy that would generate sympathy rather than scandal. But Catherine had one more surprise for Charleston society. On the night before her planned departure, she disappeared from her locked room, leaving only a letter that would be discovered by her maid the next morning. The letter Catherine left behind contained only 13 words, but they destroyed the Middleton family's reputation more effectively than any scandal could have. "I have gone to find my true family. Do not follow me. Catherine." Elizabeth Middleton collapsed when she read those words, understanding immediately that her daughter had chosen exile over submission. William Middleton crushed the paper in his fist, knowing that Catherine's disappearance would raise questions that no amount of money could silence. Catherine had indeed escaped, but not in the way her parents imagined. Instead of fleeing north to find Marcus, she had hidden in the slave quarters of her own plantation. Mama Rose, the elderly woman who had raised Catherine when Elizabeth was too delicate for motherhood, had agreed to conceal her in the abandoned overseer's cabin at the far edge of the rice fields. "Child, you done lost your mind," Rose had whispered when Catherine appeared at her door, "but I ain't gonna let them kill your baby." Rose understood what Catherine's parents refused to accept. Love had no respect for the boundaries that society created. The hiding place was perfect because William Middleton would never think to search the slave quarters for his daughter. The abandoned cabin sat among thick woods where rice workers had once lived before newer quarters were built closer to the main house. Catherine spent her days helping Rose with cooking and cleaning, learning skills that her privileged upbringing had never required. For the first time in her life, she worked with her hands, tended fires, washed clothes, and discovered a satisfaction in useful labor that embroidery had never provided. The weeks hiding in the quarters taught Catherine truths about plantation life that 22 years in the mansion had concealed. She learned how the enslaved workers created families despite forced separations, how they preserved African traditions through secret songs and stories, how they maintained dignity in circumstances designed to destroy human spirit. Most importantly, she learned about the underground network that helped fugitive slaves reach freedom in the North. The network was led by Daniel, a free black man who worked as a blacksmith in Charleston but used his position to forge papers and coordinate escapes. Daniel visited the plantation monthly to repair tools and secretly meet with slaves planning to run. When Rose introduced Catherine to Daniel, his reaction was immediate skepticism. "White woman gonna get us all killed," he said bluntly. "They find out we helping you, they burn down every black house in Charleston." But Catherine had something valuable to offer: detailed knowledge of how plantation security worked and access to money that could fund other escapes. Catherine convinced Daniel to help by sharing information about her father's business practices, guard schedules, and the locations of dogs used to track runaways. More importantly, she revealed the locations where her father kept emergency cash, gold pieces that could finance multiple escape attempts. "I can't buy my freedom," Catherine explained, "but I can help others buy theirs." Daniel began to see Catherine not as a privileged white woman playing at rebellion, but as a genuine ally whose insider knowledge could save lives. The collaboration between Catherine and Daniel's network created opportunities that had never existed before. Catherine used her knowledge of her father's correspondence to identify when he would be traveling, leaving the plantation less heavily guarded. She provided maps of safe paths through the rice fields and warned of planned security sweeps. Most dangerously, she helped forge letters of transit that allowed enslaved workers to travel between plantations without suspicion, letters that were actually used to move fugitives toward freedom. But Catherine's pregnancy was advancing, and her hiding place was becoming less secure. Rose worried that Catherine's condition would soon become obvious to anyone who saw her, making concealment impossible. "Baby gonna come whether we ready or not," Rose warned. "And when it do, whole world gonna know whose child it is." The baby would be living proof of Catherine's relationship with Marcus, evidence that no amount of denial could explain away. The crisis arrived in October when Catherine went into labor 3 weeks earlier than expected. Rose had prepared for the birth, but complications developed that required help she couldn't provide alone. The baby was breech, and Catherine was bleeding more than was safe. Rose made the desperate decision to summon Mary, another slave woman with experience in difficult births. But Mary's husband was suspicious about why she was being called to help deliver a white woman's baby in the slave quarters. Mary's husband, Samuel, had good reason for suspicion. He was one of William Middleton's most trusted overseers, a man who had earned his position by reporting on the activities of other slaves. Samuel understood that helping Catherine could mean death for everyone involved, but he also realized that the situation offered an opportunity for advancement. If he reported Catherine's location to William Middleton, he might earn freedom for himself and his family. The temptation proved too strong to resist. Samuel's betrayal came at the worst possible moment. As Catherine struggled through a difficult labor, fighting to bring her child safely into the world, Samuel was riding toward the main house to inform William Middleton that his daughter was hiding in the slave quarters, pregnant with a slave's child. The timing created a race between life and death. Would Catherine's baby be born before Samuel's information reached her father? The baby arrived first, a healthy boy with skin light enough to pass for white, but eyes that unmistakably reflected his father's intelligence and strength. Catherine held her son and whispered, "Gabriel," choosing a name that meant messenger of God. But even as she celebrated his birth, she could hear horses approaching through the woods. Samuel had succeeded in his betrayal, and William Middleton was coming with armed men to end the scandal once and for all. Rose made a decision that saved both Catherine and Gabriel's lives. Instead of trying to hide or defend their position, she helped Catherine escape through the back window of the cabin while she remained inside to delay the search. When William Middleton arrived with his overseers, Rose claimed that Catherine had left days earlier, heading north to find Marcus. She showed them evidence that Catherine had been there, but insisted she was long gone. Rose's sacrifice bought Catherine precious time to reach Daniel's network. Catherine's escape with a newborn baby should have been impossible, but the underground network proved more sophisticated than anyone imagined. Daniel had prepared contingency plans that included safe houses, forged papers, and even a wet nurse who could care for Gabriel if Catherine became unable to travel. The network moved them from hiding place to hiding place, always staying ahead of the search parties that William Middleton had organized to track them down. The search for Catherine became a public obsession in Charleston society. William Middleton had initially tried to keep his daughter's disappearance quiet, but the extensive manhunt made secrecy impossible. Rumors began spreading about why Charleston's most eligible heiress had vanished so completely. Some suggested she had been kidnapped by pirates. Others whispered about elopement with a married man. But the most dangerous rumors hinted at something far more scandalous. The truth emerged when one of Daniel's network members was captured and tortured into revealing information about Catherine's escape. The revelation that Catherine Middleton had given birth to a mixed-race child sent shockwaves through Charleston society that could be felt from the waterfront to the finest mansions. The scandal was so enormous that it threatened to destroy not just the Middleton family, but the entire social structure that Charleston's elite depended upon. William Middleton's response was swift and brutal. He disowned Catherine publicly, announcing that his daughter had died of fever during a trip north. He sold every slave who had been involved in helping Catherine, separating families and destroying lives to eliminate any witnesses to the scandal. Most tragically, he ordered Rose to be sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama, sending the woman who had raised Catherine into brutal conditions that amounted to a death sentence. But the scandal continued to grow because Catherine had anticipated her father's reaction. Before escaping, she had written detailed letters to prominent abolitionists in the North, describing her experiences and exposing the brutalities of plantation life from an insider's perspective. These letters began appearing in Northern newspapers just as Charleston society was trying to forget that Catherine had ever existed. Catherine's letters created a sensation because they provided the most detailed insider account of Southern plantation life that had ever been published. She described the daily violence that maintained slavery, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, the deliberate destruction of families through sales and separations. Most devastatingly, she wrote about the psychological damage that slavery inflicted on white families, turning children into monsters and parents into dealers in human flesh. The letters made Catherine a celebrity in abolitionist circles and a demon in the South. Southern newspapers denounced her as a traitor and madwoman, claiming that she had been corrupted by Northern radicals. But the damage was done. Catherine's first-hand testimony provided abolitionists with ammunition they had never possessed before, and her story became a rallying cry for the movement to end slavery. Meanwhile, Catherine herself remained in hiding, moving from safe house to safe house with Gabriel, always one step ahead of the bounty hunters that Southern slaveholders had hired to find her. The network that protected her grew stronger as news of her courage spread, with new allies joining the cause inspired by her willingness to sacrifice everything for love and principle. The final blow to the Middleton family came when Marcus was discovered working as a teacher in a school for free blacks in Philadelphia. Northern newspapers published interviews with him, describing his education, his character, and his love for Catherine. The articles made it impossible to dismiss their relationship as the delusion of a confused white woman. Marcus was clearly an intelligent, dignified man whose only crime had been falling in love with someone society said he couldn't have. The revelation that Marcus was not only alive but thriving in freedom intensified the scandal beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Charleston society realized that they were facing not just a personal tragedy, but a direct challenge to everything they believed about racial hierarchy and social order. If Catherine Middleton, product of the finest Southern upbringing, could choose a black man over white society, then perhaps their entire worldview was built on lies. The confrontation that would destroy the Middleton family forever began on Christmas Eve, 1827, when Catherine made a decision that shocked even her closest allies in the underground network. After months of hiding, constantly moving from safe house to safe house with baby Gabriel, she announced her intention to return to Charleston. "I'm tired of running," she told Daniel, whose network had protected her for 4 months. "It's time to face what I've done and make them face what they are." Daniel thought Catherine had lost her mind. "You go back there, they gonna kill you and that baby," he warned. "Your daddy got $1,000 bounty on your head and every slave catcher from here to Georgia looking for you." But Catherine had a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. She intended to attend Christmas service at St. Philip's Episcopal Church, where Charleston's elite gathered to display their piety and social standing. She would walk through those doors carrying Gabriel, forcing Charleston society to confront the living proof of their hypocrisy. Catherine's plan required allies inside Charleston, and she found them in the most unexpected places. A group of free blacks and sympathetic whites had been secretly organizing to support her return, understanding that her public appearance could shatter the silence that protected slavery's worst abuses. Led by Sarah Grimke, daughter of a prominent Charleston family who had secretly converted to abolitionism, this group had been distributing Catherine's letters throughout the city, preparing the ground for her dramatic return. Sarah Grimke had risked everything to support Catherine because she recognized a kindred spirit. Like Catherine, Sarah had been raised in Charleston's elite society and had gradually awakened to the moral horror of slavery. But where Sarah had expressed her opposition through quiet rebellion and eventual exile to the north, Catherine had chosen direct confrontation with the system that had shaped them both. Sarah saw Catherine's courage as an inspiration and a challenge to her own more cautious approach to reform. The Christmas Eve service at St. Philip's Church had always been Charleston's most important social event, where the city's most powerful families displayed their wealth and respectability. The church, with its soaring white columns and imported stained glass, represented everything that Charleston society valued: tradition, hierarchy, and the divine blessing of their way of life. For Catherine to appear there with Gabriel would be like setting off a bomb in the heart of their world. Catherine prepared for her return by writing one final letter, this one addressed to the congregation of St. Philip's Church. The letter explained her choices, defended her love for Marcus, and challenged Charleston's Christians to reconcile their faith with their participation in slavery. "You sing of Jesus' love while buying and selling his children," she wrote. "You speak of Christian family values while destroying families for profit. Today, I bring you the chance to choose between your comfort and your salvation." The letter was distributed throughout Charleston on Christmas morning by a network of supporters who had positioned themselves at key locations throughout the city. By the time the church bells rang calling worshipers to service, hundreds of people had read Catherine's words. The reactions ranged from fury to fascination, but no one could ignore the challenge she had issued. Charleston society understood that this Christmas service would be unlike any other in the city's history. Catherine arrived at St. Philip's Church wearing a simple blue dress that had been her mother's favorite, carrying Gabriel in a white christening gown that proclaimed his innocence regardless of the circumstances of his birth. She walked through the church doors with her head held high, moving down the center aisle as conversations died and heads turned. The silence that followed her progress was so complete that her footsteps on the marble floor echoed like gunshots. William Middleton sat in the family pew, third row from the front, where Middletons had worshipped for 3 generations. When he saw Catherine approaching with Gabriel, his face went white with shock and rage. Elizabeth Middleton fainted immediately, collapsing onto the pew in a rustle of silk and smelling salts. But Catherine didn't stop walking until she reached the front of the church, where she turned to face the congregation that had shaped her entire life. The moment Catherine turned to face the congregation, every assumption that Charleston society had made about their scandal was destroyed. Gabriel, now 4 months old, had skin light enough to pass for white, but his features unmistakably reflected his African heritage. More importantly, Catherine's bearing made it clear that she felt no shame about her choices. She stood with the confidence of a woman who had found truth and was prepared to defend it against the world. Reverend Dalcho, who had baptized Catherine as an infant and confirmed her as a young woman, stood frozen at the pulpit. He had planned to deliver a sermon about the sanctity of Christian family life, but Catherine's presence made those words impossible to speak. Instead, he found himself staring at a living challenge to everything his church had taught about racial hierarchy and social order. The silence stretched until Catherine herself broke it. "I have come home," Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "to present my son to the community that helped shape me." Her words were simple, but their implications were revolutionary. By claiming Gabriel as her son in this sacred space, Catherine was demanding that Charleston society acknowledge not just her choices, but the humanity of every person they had enslaved and brutalized. The congregation's response was immediate and violent. Men shouted that she was a disgrace to her family and her race. Women wept and declared that she had brought shame upon all Christian womanhood. Children stared in fascination at the first mixed-race baby many of them had ever seen. But through the chaos, some voices rose in support. Sarah Grimke stood and applauded. Several free blacks who had gained entrance to the usually segregated service began singing a hymn that others gradually joined. William Middleton finally found his voice and roared for the church wardens to remove his daughter by force. But as the wardens approached, Catherine made an announcement that froze everyone in place. "Before you touch me," she said calmly, "you should know that every word spoken in this church today is being recorded by journalists from northern newspapers. Your reaction to my son and me will be reported throughout the country. Choose carefully how you wish Charleston to be remembered." The threat of northern newspaper coverage changed everything, because Charleston's elite understood that their economic survival depended on maintaining relationships with northern merchants and financiers. A public scene of violence against a woman holding a baby would confirm every northern stereotype about southern brutality. The congregation found themselves trapped between their outrage and their economic interests, forced to choose between satisfying their anger and protecting their wealth. Into this standoff walked Marcus himself, having traveled south in secret to support Catherine's dramatic gambit. His appearance in the church created a sensation that made Catherine's entrance seem subtle by comparison. Here was the man whose relationship with Catherine had caused the entire scandal, standing in Charleston's most sacred space, claiming his place in a society that had tried to destroy him. Marcus had changed during his months of freedom in Philadelphia. He stood taller, spoke with greater confidence, and carried himself with the dignity of a man who had discovered his own worth. His education, always impressive, had been refined through exposure to northern intellectual circles where his opinions were valued rather than feared. Most importantly, he had gained the perspective that came from seeing slavery from the outside, understanding it as a system rather than simply experiencing it as a victim. The reunion between Catherine and Marcus in front of Charleston's elite was the most public declaration of love that the antebellum South had ever witnessed. They embraced without shame. Marcus kissed his son's forehead, and Catherine took his arm as they stood together facing the congregation. Their defiance was complete and uncompromising, a rejection of every social convention that had governed their lives. But the price of their courage became clear immediately. William Middleton stood and formally disowned Catherine in front of the entire congregation, declaring that she was no longer his daughter and had no claim to the Middleton name or fortune. Elizabeth Middleton, revived from her faint, added her own denunciation, calling Catherine a disgrace to womanhood and Christianity. The formal rejection by her parents in such a public setting was designed to destroy Catherine emotionally, but she accepted it with grace that surprised even her supporters. "I release you from any obligation to me," Catherine replied to her parents, "just as I release myself from any obligation to participate in your sins." Her response transformed the confrontation from a family dispute into a moral challenge. Catherine was not just rejecting her parents' authority, she was rejecting the entire system of values that had created that authority. The service ended in chaos as the congregation divided into factions supporting or opposing Catherine's actions. Some families left in disgust, declaring that the church had been defiled by Catherine's presence. Others remained to express support for her courage, even if they couldn't approve of her choices. The division within Charleston's elite that had been growing since Catherine's first escape became an open break that would never heal. Outside the church, the confrontation continued as crowds gathered to witness the unprecedented scene of a white woman publicly claiming a mixed-race child as her own. Catherine and Marcus found themselves surrounded by supporters and opponents, journalists and curiosity seekers, in a scene that resembled a political rally more than a church service. The Christmas peace of Charleston had been shattered by truths that could no longer be hidden. William Middleton's attempt to have Catherine and Marcus arrested failed because no specific law had been broken. South Carolina prohibited marriage between whites and blacks, but Catherine and Marcus had never claimed to be married. Their relationship, while scandalous, was not technically illegal. The legal system that had been designed to control black behavior proved inadequate for addressing a white woman's rebellion. The aftermath of the Christmas confrontation destroyed the Middleton family's social position within weeks. Friends stopped calling, business associates canceled contracts, and invitations to social events disappeared. William Middleton found himself isolated in a community where reputation was everything, and his daughter's actions had made the family name synonymous with scandal. Elizabeth Middleton became a recluse, unable to face the whispers and stares that followed her everywhere. But Catherine's victory came at an enormous personal cost. The constant stress and exposure had weakened her health, and the confrontation with her parents had broken something inside her that would never heal. She had won the battle for recognition and respect, but she had lost the family and community that had shaped her identity. The price of freedom, she discovered, was the destruction of everything she had previously known as home. The final chapter of Catherine's story played out over the following months as Charleston society struggled to return to normal after being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their way of life. Catherine and Marcus, with baby Gabriel, eventually left Charleston for Philadelphia, where they could live openly as a family. But their brief return had accomplished something unprecedented. They had forced an entire community to witness the human cost of slavery and the possibility of love transcending racial boundaries. Catherine Middleton died of tuberculosis in 1831, just 4 years after her dramatic Christmas return to Charleston. Marcus raised Gabriel as a single father, ensuring that the boy received the education and opportunities that society had tried to deny him. Gabriel grew up to become a prominent abolitionist and educator, carrying forward his parents' legacy of resistance and hope. The Middleton plantation was sold at auction in 1832, unable to survive the financial and social destruction that Catherine's rebellion had caused. William Middleton died bankrupt and alone, having lost everything he had tried to protect by rejecting his daughter's love. Elizabeth Middleton lived until 1845, spending her final years writing letters to Catherine that could never be sent, seeking forgiveness for choices that could never be undone. Charleston society eventually recovered from the scandal, but the memory of Catherine's courage continued to inspire others who questioned the foundations of Southern civilization. Her story became a legend whispered in slave quarters and abolitionist meetings, proof that love could triumph over hatred and that one person's courage could challenge an entire system of oppression. The true legacy of Catherine Middleton's rebellion wasn't the destruction it caused, but the possibilities it revealed. In choosing love over law, conscience over comfort, and truth over tradition, she had shown that the barriers separating people were not divinely ordained but humanly constructed. And if they were constructed by humans, they could be destroyed by human courage and human love. If you enjoyed this powerful story of love triumphing over society's cruelest barriers, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the courage it takes to choose love over everything else. Catherine's story reminds us that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to hate. What stories of forbidden love and courage do you know? Drop them in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from.